Hi, I'm Lukas Kendall. I was a soundtrack CD producer for many years. I worked on the collector's edition boutique CDs of almost all of the Star Trek films and television soundtracks. And you're listening to Trek Untold.
Welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. On today's show, we're getting musical once more, but taking a look at a different part of that industry. In the past, I've had a few composers here on Trek Untold, where those music makers work on making the sounds of Star Trek. But this week's guest is a person who took that music and made it readily available for all to enjoy. And that person is Lukas Kendall. Lukas is responsible for bringing us some of the most complete Star Trek albums of all time, releasing the remastered orchestral scores on outrageously comprehensive CD sets from the films and television shows. If you ever owned an album of Star Trek music, there's a good chance it was released through Lukas's label. On top of that, Lukas also founded Film Score Monthly, a publication which granted him access to a lot of major composers, much like how this show has given me a chance to chat with some folks who I otherwise would have never had a chance to speak with. So besides talking about Trek music, we're also telling tales about some of their composers and a few other folks out there in the music world who happen to have some connections to Star Trek. So get ready to deep dive into the world of Star Trek scores as we chat with Lukas Kendall. But before we begin this week's episode, I want to remind you to follow Trek Untold on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Trek Untold, all one word. You can get show updates, check out some fun memes, and let me know what you think about what's going on with the current events in the Star Trek universe. You can also support this show directly on Patreon at patreon.com/TrekUntold, where you can support this show for as little as $2 a month. At higher tiers, you can listen to the shows before they come out, know about my guests well in advance, and even have a chance to ask them questions, get transcripts of these episodes to make sure you get all the info, and more benefits coming soon, including watch parties and live streams. But that's all dependent on more fans like you coming over and letting me know you want to be a part of events like that. If you want some Trek Untold merchandise, check out our Teespring store for gear and apparel, including shirts, hats, stickers, water bottles, notebooks, and a whole lot more. New designs will be added throughout the year, so it's always worth taking a peek. Trek Untold also has an Amazon shop where you can peruse everything Star Trek, sci-fi, and geeky on Amazon in one convenient location. If you're looking for a gift for the Trekkie in your life, or maybe want to see some of my favorite non-Star Trek things that you can get for yourself, check out the link for my Amazon shop in the show notes on the audio version and in the description below this video on YouTube. If you're listening to us on iTunes or any other audio platforms that allow for ratings and reviews, please leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review to help out this show. If you're watching it on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to us at youtube.com/nerdnewstoday and give the video a thumbs up and a comment. All of these things help more people find this show and to continue growing and bringing you awesome guests each and every week. Now, without further ado, let's beam in this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And welcome back to Trek Untold. Now, joining me on the other side of the screen, I'm trying to figure out a good, catchy, funny way to, introduce a music person here, but I'm always terrible at this. So, hey, we're joined by Mr. Lukas Kendall today. Lukas, how's it going?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I like your show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, yeah, I feel bad here because, I'm so terrible at music stuff, so I'm going to be struggling today with some words and vocabulary and things like that.
Don't worry anything about it. So when I was a kid, I was such a music fan, a film music fan, and this was before the internet. So I created a newsletter that became a magazine called Film Score Monthly, and then it became a record label. So I have spent 30 to 35 years talking about this stuff.
All right, good, because you're going to save my butt a lot today. Yeah, we're going to totally talk about Film Score Monthly. That's on my list of things to get to.
Okay.
But yeah, let's just jump on in here. And Lukas, what's your earliest memory of Star Trek? I'm pretty sure you're a fan growing up of this stuff, right?
I am. I was born in 1974, so in the early 80s. I was first into Star Wars through the toys and the radio show, if people remember that. They got into the music from the radio show and the storybooks and the comic books. And back in those days, you saw the movies last. So you tended to discover the comics and the photo novels. So I remember in third grade in silent reading, I would read the Star Wars novelizations. And then I moved on to the James Blish Star Trek adaptation. So Spock Must Die. That freaked me out about the transporter. If you think about it, that it kills you every time.
Yeah, let's not get into that discussion. That's like a whole other episode. Oh my God. Oh man, no.
So anyway, so in the early 80s, I was a nerd. This is the high wedgies era. So this is before geeks were cool. This was when it was really not cool. So, my escape was science fiction, and I discovered Star Trek and was watching it on Channel 10, every afternoon or evening or whenever they'd show it, and got into the movies. The first movie I saw in the theater, I think, was Star Trek 3. Just fond memories of the imagination and the whole Star Trek world, and what a great thing it was to discover as a kid, a world where everybody was nice.
Yeah, I like it that you got into this basically was because a lot of the ancillary merchandise, like, the audio plays and the books and things like that. Like, I got back into Star Trek because of the toys. So it's just kind of funny how that sort of thing works its way back into us.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very, you're probably much younger than I am, but the early 80s and late 70s, it was sort of this halcyon era for this nerd culture, and Star Wars was our universe. And it was just so cool. And then you sort of moved on to Close Encounters and Superman and Blade Runner and comic books. And it was big. It was the original generation of that geek era for Generation X.
So, Lukas, let's get a little bit more background information about you. So we know that you were a super awesome, cool nerd growing up in the best era of nerddom possible, at least before today's modern times. But, where were you born? Who were your parents and what did they do? And what did little Lukas want to be when he grew up?
Well, nobody cares about this. But since you asked, I was born in Hanover, New Hampshire, because my dad's a doctor and he was doing a residency at the time at Dartmouth. And then when I was 3 in 1977, he got a job at the hospital in Martha's Vineyard. So I grew up in Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, okay.
And I was a little smarty pants Jewish kid, smallest kid in the class. And I wasn't from that community. So it was very much felt like the outcast, very much didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. And so the science fiction and comic books, that was sort of how I found my own sense of belonging. I have a funny Martha's Vineyard Star Trek story.
Oh, go ahead.
So I was reading an article in Starlog magazine, an interview with Diana Muldaur, where she said she spent summers on Martha's Vineyard. And I thought, wait a minute, I know a classmate at high school who has the same last name. So the next day in school, I asked her, and I was like, Darty, I saw this interview with an actress named Diana, and she was like, yeah, my aunt's on Star Trek.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, whoa. And I knew the family, that offshoot of Muldaur's, and they actually arranged for me to meet Diana Muldaur, Aunt Dinny, when she was on the Vineyard. This is like 1991 or 92. Wow. She had already left Star Trek, and she was either on LA Law or had left LA Law. But for me, it was like the coolest thing ever. It was like a personal audience, and it was like around the corner from my house at this horse farm where she was picking up another one of her nieces. Anyway, she was lovely. She retired there, and the family is great. And so that's my Martha's Vineyard Star Trek story.
And so what did little Lukas want to be when he grew up?
I used to draw a lot. I didn't know, and it's like I still don't know, but I always liked making things. I always liked creative projects. So I've kind of become a filmmaker and a writer because I like to produce things. I like to write things that I can produce. I like to direct them so it comes out the way I want it. I made a sci-fi short film that I hope you don't mind my plugging. It's called Skyfighter. You can find it online at Dust. So if you just type Skyfighter, 2 words, short film into YouTube or Google, it'll pop up because it got a couple million views and it did pretty well. And I'd like to make a feature film about that. I have a lot of things I'd like to do. But I'm, yes, I would still like to be a filmmaker when I grow up.
Oh, very cool. And yeah, I was actually looking at your YouTube channel, in fact, and we're going to make sure we link it in the show notes. So anybody wants to go ahead and see all the different work that Lukas is doing and some of the behind the scenes stuff and other films he made, go ahead and check out his YouTube channel in the show notes. But I was watching a video that you did on there, Lukas, which was like a little bio about yourself.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I did my research. I did some homework here, and I saw there's a photo of, I'm going to assume it's you as a child, next to George Takei.
Yeah, I have more hair. Yes, I went to the creation conventions. I met George. I met Walter. I don't remember how many. They were all the same. It was very disillusioning because I was looking for my people. I was like, where are my people? Because the kids at high school, I had some friends, but they weren't really my people. And I go to Temple and like, those actually are my people, but they didn't really feel like my people. They didn't like Star Trek. And I was pretty good at sports. I was on the baseball team, but those weren't my people. So I was like, where are my people? And then I thought, oh my God, Star Trek conventions. Those are my people. And I went, and all they cared about was all that crap they could buy in the dealer's hall. I liked the stories. I liked the storytelling. I liked the meaning of what it was all about. And whenever I tried to talk to somebody, it was just like trivia. It was just these very superficial details. And I thought creation set their conventions up to kind of, it's like Charlie Brown talking about Christmas being too commercial, I guess. Like, boy, those guys would sell anything. Those guys would sell a kidney stone.
I mean, to be fair, I would buy James Doohan's kidney stone. I mean, that's a pretty cool thing to have.
I don't know. Those guys have had just so anyway, I have a picture of me with George Takei, and that was right after Star Trek V. And there was a comic book inker also sitting next to him named Arnie Starr, who's an actor. I think he was in Star Trek. And he was a great comic book inker. And I remember seeing the page he was working on of the DC comic, and then the struts were going the wrong way. I was like, hey, the penciler did the struts going the wrong way. Do you want me to fix it? He's like, no. But I found the panel and he did fix it. Huh. 33 years ago. Yeah.
You are actually a hero in the Star Trek universe. We didn't even know it. So, you are a music producer, and I'd like to know, we're talking about you doing, wanting to do films and wanting to do stuff in the creative world. So when does music actually begin to fit into this? And is Star Trek a part of that story?
It is. So I'm not really a music producer, but I have been like a CD producer. And the distinction is that I was never involved in the actual production of the music. I was never involved in conducting and the orchestras and the mixing and all that engineering.
You're more like in the licensing side of things, right?
Right. So I had my magazine, Film Score Monthly, and we would review our favorite soundtrack CDs. And when you're a big soundtrack CD nerd, what you realize and what you learn is that a lot of the CDs came out and they were incomplete. Because back in the day, there might be 90 minutes of music in the film, but the little LP would only hold 35. So the composer would pick the 35 minutes that were best for a record, and that would be the record album. But years later, all of us nerds, we wanted to hear the whole thing. So there are these boutique CD companies, and I created one of them that would license from, in this case, Paramount, the soundtrack rights, and we'd go into the vaults and we'd get the tapes transferred, and we'd do new mixes where we had to, and we would sort of curate these expanded collector nerd editions, and that was what I did for a good 15 years. And I was involved in one way or another with all of the Star Trek movies through Nemesis. There are a lot of partners I had in these projects, so I don't mean to be taking all the credit. I was one of a team that did the 15-disc box set of the original series music that La La Land released. We subsequently did a 50th anniversary album that had the animated series music. I did a big box set of all the Ron Jones composed scores to the Next Generation. I was involved in some other album projects from the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise. So, we kept very busy doing these. And again, it was a whole team of us. So we would do the licenses, we'd get the music, we'd sort of figure out what the sequencing should be. We would correct any defects that had surfaced in the tapes or in the transfers, and we would write the liner notes, and we'd proofread the liner notes, and we'd select the artwork, and we'd design the covers. And so that was my world for quite some time.
Just because we know you already have some pretty serious nerd cred here, but you did a bunch of other things too besides Trek that I saw on the I think it was the La La Land website, in fact, and I think on your resume as well. So if you don't mind, just can you tell my audience some of the other things that you've gotten to work on in the music world?
Well, it's all the soundtrack CDs. But when I had my company, Film Score Monthly, we did 250 albums, and those are some very famous movies. Everything from The French Connection to Patton to The Wild Bunch to Body Heat. And The Man from U.N.C.L.E., I Spy, it goes on. And then as a freelancer and as an independent producer for some of my former competitors, because after a while I just got tired of having my own label, I worked on many more. There was a brief bit of time when I worked on some James Bond soundtracks. So if you have like the You Only Live Twice CD that has the extra music and the bonus tracks at the end, I put that together for them in like 3 weeks, very hastily when they suddenly decided they wanted it and had no money. So and then when I was doing Film Score Monthly, there was a lot of composer interviews that we did, a lot of chronicling and documentation, and ad nauseum.
So I want to ask you a few more questions about Film Score Monthly, but I actually want to know before we get into that, are you like musically inclined in any way? Like, do you actually play any instruments or anything like that?
I'm a dilettante. So when I was a kid, I played a few instruments at different times. I did study music at college. I do read music. I understand music theory, but I don't have any real keyboard skills. And I read it very slowly. So if it's in bass clef, it's like, if it's an alto clef for the violas, I'm like, so I'm a dilettante, but I do love it. And I think I do understand it. And when we were doing my short film, the scoring was very interesting. It was very fun to get a chance to work with the composer and really get into the subtleties of how you do that. It's very hard.
Yeah, and I like the fact that also it's cool that you're admitting the fact that you might not be a musician necessarily, but this is still a world that you can be a big, big part of. I think that's kind of good to know for a lot of folks there who might want to be in that realm, but maybe they don't know how to read music even or things like that. There's other avenues you can do.
They're total ignoramuses who do this. No, I'm like super highly educated, relatively speaking. But it's funny because one time I was out to dinner, it's like 20 years ago with my family, and on the restaurant there was like classical music on the sound system, and my dad was like, "I wonder what that is." And I said, "Oh, that's Debussy." And he said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Because you spent $200,000 for me to go to Amherst." So
money well spent, right there. That's the proof right there.
Yeah, there you go.
So let's talk a little bit more about Film Score Monthly now, because I remember actually seeing that even in stores. I feel like, or maybe I didn't make it up. I have no idea, but I feel like I might. Well,
we used to have it in Tower Records, and there was some limited newsstand distribution, very limited. It got around,
it's a name I know, which is weird because I'm not like I said earlier, I'm not like the most musically inclined, but as soon as I saw that, I knew it. So, I mean, I heard a little bit about the story behind it. So, yeah, it's really a literal grassroots thing that you kind of blew up into this huge thing. So, yeah, please tell me about the journey with that.
Well, it never became huge. It was, I think we were printing maybe 5,000 or 6,000 copies at the most. And it was a unique period of time. It was really, the internet existed. It was being used on campuses, but it was not commercially being used until the mid 90s. And so you couldn't get news. I mean, so if you wanted to learn who was James Horner, what did he do, you couldn't just look it up. You couldn't go to IMDb and get a list of his movies. So there was this whole subculture of people who made filmographies and made lists and wrote our own music reviews and collected the records and made our own discographies. So it was very homemade. And I just was a very entrepreneurial kid. I mean, I was on Martha's Vineyard. I was a teenager. There weren't a lot of other kids that shared my interests in film music. My parents were divorced. I was very lonely and probably very interior and needed distractions. And it was very distracting figuring out how to write and edit a newsletter and correspond with people. So I had a letter in the old Starlog magazine saying, "Let's start a fan club." And like a dozen people wrote me. And I just started sending them a monthly newsletter like, "Hey, I just saw Back to the Future 3 and it had really good music." And that was kind of the depth and extent of the newsletter. But over time, I met more people. I met one of the Star Trek composers on Martha's Vineyard. His name is Jay Chattaway, and he did music for the Next Generation through Enterprise. He wrote the Inner Light music. And a super nice man and very talented, but really a great person. And I used to, when I was reaching out with my little newsletter to actual composers in Hollywood, because I had met a few people who said, "Hey, I can introduce you to people who might like this." I sent a letter to Jay Chattaway, and he wrote back and said, "By the way, you could have looked me up in your local phone book." So I need to explain for the kids. A phone book was this directory of people's telephone numbers, which only went to their houses, not to their personal pockets. But it was true. It said Jay Chattaway in Catena, so Hagertown. So it was funny. He had a summer home on Martha's Vineyard, so I met him there as well.
Yeah, I gotta tell you too, Lucas, like 5 or 6 thousand is still a pretty big number. And the fact is, that 5 or 6 thousand did ultimately get you access to a lot of really big folks to talk to. I know you interviewed a lot of people for Film Score Monthly. Who would you say was, I guess I want to find out who's the most eccentric musician? Who's the most fascinating eyebrow raising musician or composer you spoke to for the magazine?
I don't know. Maybe the answer will come to me. I haven't thought about this in a while. I don't want to. There were some more, I would say, obscure composers who were a little eccentric. Here's a good story. So the guy Elliot Goldenthal, who scored Alien 3 and Demolition Man, and he lots and lots of great movies. I told this story on my blog. So I reached out to him because I wanted to interview him for Demolition Man. And I called him in the afternoon. I got his number in New York. And he goes, can we do it later? I said, sure. What time? He goes, how about 1? It's already like 4 in the afternoon. I go, 1 in the morning? He goes, yeah. And I'm a college kid, so I'm up. I'm like, okay. So I call him back at 1 a.m. and he's like slurring. He's wasted. And I learned that he was pretty much like an alcoholic who would work all night as this kind of like alcoholic vampire doing his scores. And Elliot Goldenthal, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry if this is speaking out of school, but it happened and it was funny.
I'm pretty sure we're safe here. I doubt he's listening to Trek Untold, but hey, you never know. If he does, hey, shout out to Elliot.
So that was an interesting story. I was friends with, I was friends with Basil Poledouris, who composed Conan and RoboCop and Hunt for October. And he was a really great person. He's also a red shirt in a Star Trek episode. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah, he told me once. He goes, I was in Star Trek. I was like, what? He was a student at USC. He went to USC at the same time as George Lucas, and there was a whole gang of them who went to USC. And like for spending money, they would go be extras on Hollywood TV shows. So Basil Poledouris, the composer of RoboCop, Hunt for October, Free Willy, Starship Troopers, is one of the red shirts in the episode Obsession.
So you're telling me now so you're telling me now is I got to go track him down because I have an excuse to get him on the show.
Well, I have bad news. Basil died.
You got my hopes up, Lucas. You got my hopes up.
I'm sorry. It's very sad. I was just a couple of months ago at a tribute concert that they did for him at Disney Hall, and it was a great tribute concert. He was really a great person, but he did get cancer and pass away. And but he was also in the Nazi Planet episode. You may remember that when they're trapped in the room with the guy and they're trying to get the guy to like give one last speech saying Nazis are bad. And one of the guards goes up and puts his face in the window and looks like that. That was Basil. But it's not the guy that the bad guy says, go check the booth. So that's a different actor. This is how cheap they were. He goes, go check the booth. And then that other actor goes out of frame. And then there's the shot of Basil doing this in the window. And then Basil's also a Klingon in Errand of Mercy.
That is some really cool stuff. I never knew that. And Basil's music too. I don't really know composers or things like that well, but like RoboCop, Starship Troopers, Conan the Barbarian, those are amazing soundtracks.
They're great. He was really a great composer. I had a sort of interesting, sort of adversarial relationship with Jerry Goldsmith.
Really?
Because Jerry was genius composer, beloved by everybody, by us. But he was very sensitive. And by the time we were doing Film Score Monthly, we were a bunch of sort of outspoken nerds. And we would be like, I like this one, but not this one. He copied himself here. And he I don't like that theme. That one seems too sentimental. So, that was what we did as nerds. It's not our job and we would send these magazines and a lot of people would read them and go, it doesn't mean anything to them if a bunch of fans are ranking their scores or complaining about that they thought the score to Mr. Baseball was silly, which it was. It doesn't matter. But Jerry was very sensitive, and he thought these guys were jerks, and he just didn't like us. And his kid was Joel Goldsmith, who has a co-composing credit on First Contact. He was also a composer. He also Joel Goldsmith did some sound design on Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And Joel was kind of an instigator and would like always fax Jerry whenever we did a particularly negative review. So I went to the scoring session of LA Confidential as a guest of one of the percussionists. And I was like, I don't think Jerry likes me. And this percussionist, Emil Richards, who's a genius percussionist, was like, Jerry's he's a sweetheart. He's a doll. Don't worry. He'll love you. I'm like, okay. So I go to the date and I'm sitting in the back with my friend, the percussionist. And he goes, all right, I'm going to tell him you're here. He walks up into the booth. I'm like, comes back. He's got, it's like someone died. And he goes, I got to tell you, I told him you were here. And he said, get that little shit out of here. I don't want him here. But I said, Jerry, he loves you. I mean, can he stay? And so then he said, he can stay. So it was very tense for me. I mean, it was like meeting the Pope or something. It was very weird. Why would Jerry Goldsmith care what some kid, I was like 24, wrote about, his music. But then I went to introduce myself because I'm not a coward. There are many things you can say about me, but I'm not chicken about this stuff. So I went in to see him and he goes, yeah, I've written a lot of shit about me, Lukas. I just said something like, I'm sorry. And he goes, okay, well, you can stay. Hang out. We're having lunch or whatever it was. It was just a very weird, it was very memorable to me. And I wrote about it in my blog. So if you want the long version of this story, I don't know. There were, Danny Elfman was always very cool.
He seems like
Hans Zimmer is extremely cool. Most of the great composers who have these amazing careers and who just work and work and work, they have great personalities. They're almost rabbinical, even when they're not Jewish. Like half of them are Jewish, half of them aren't. But they're very easy to talk to. They're very understanding because they make their living being the last person to go into these extremely high pressure environments to do the music. And they're dealing with studios and directors and sometimes stars. I mean, everybody's just totally frazzled and people don't know how to talk about music. And they're the person who is like, tell me what you want. I'm here for you. And they have to sort of figure out what these directors want, even though the directors can sometimes be famously inarticulate and kind of difficult. They might change their minds. They might think that, get rid of that oboe when they mean the saxophone. They don't even know what they're listening to. So the great composers they're just these very well-balanced people. And they're wonderful to talk to. Alan Silvestri is just the nicest guy. He's just super, super nice. And Michael Kamen was just a wonderful man. John Powell. I mean, I've always enjoyed meeting them. And maybe, if you sort of get them, go out and have a drink and, they'll tell you who's frustrated, who's difficult or what project they liked and what project they didn't really like. But generally they're there to get along and they're there to work. And a huge percentage of the work is not just writing the music. It's producing the score when you have all these combustible personalities.
Trek Untold will return momentarily.
Trek Untold is sponsored by Triple Fiction Productions. Celebrating 15 years in business in 2023, TFP creates 3D printed Star Trek and sci-fi inspired items that fit into any collection. Whether you're a cosplayer who wants a Starfleet phaser, a Bajoran tricorder, or a Klingon dagger, or a toy collector looking for that special accessory or diorama to make your figures truly stand out, Triple Fiction Productions has exactly what you need. And for you figure fanatics, that includes products that are the perfect size for Galoob, Mego, Playmates, and everything in between. All products are 3D printed in the US, with new designs constantly being updated on their website. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, which is a great way to save money as you build your collection. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, which is a great way to save money as you build your collection. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, where the more you order, the more discounts you receive. TFP also has a Pay What You Want section, where clearance or misprinted items are available at a discounted price. Best of all, every product can be shipped worldwide. As a special bonus for listeners of this show, Trek Untold has a special discount code just for you. Enter Untold10 at checkout for 10% off of all orders with no minimum purchase required. That's 10% off using Untold10. To see all of their products, head to triple-fictionproductions.net. Or to stay up to date on their newest products, find them on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Triple Fiction Productions, where something is only impossible until it happens.
Have you ever watched a YouTube video and said you wish you could do what they were doing? Whether it's the filming, the production, the editing. Maybe you listen to your favorite podcast and you wondered how they put that show together, how they got that great sound quality, what gear they use, how much does it cost to get started? Or maybe you checked out a video or read a book about one of your favorite entrepreneurs and it made you say, I want to live that life. I want to do what they do. Then check out my podcast, Toys and Tech of the Trade. I'm Rich Butler, and I've been making podcasts for almost 2 decades, speaking with experts across all fields to get to the bottom of the hows and whys of their achievements. Each week, I sit down with these amazing people who have carved their own path in life and share the gadgets, the gear, and the tech that they rely on to create their content, the methods that they use to run their business, and the habits and trends that are part of their daily routine and their way of life. And all of that, of course, gets put together to make them successful. We pull back the curtain on the process to help you understand what these people do differently so that you can draw inspiration and get ideas and be inspired so that you can take action today. This podcast is inspiring, educational, it's enlightening, and most of all, it's a lot of fun. I want you to join me on this journey so that you can use the tools and advice shared in this podcast to level up your business or creative endeavors, giving you all the tips, tactics, and tools so that you can transform what you're doing from a side hustle into a full-time lifestyle where you can collect a paycheck for doing what you love. Check out Toys and Tech of the Trade wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out the RageWorks Network at RageWorksNetwork.com for more info on this podcast and all of the many other great shows that we have on the RageWorks Podcast Network. That's Toys and Tech of the Trade, with some assembly required.
So, Lucas, let's get into our Star Trek talk proper now, if you will. And
okay.
Yeah, let's try and figure out now. So, how you went from Film Score Monthly to getting involved in Star Trek professionally. So, how does it actually come together? Is that through a licensing deal?
Yeah, it was all continuous because I always wanted to do Star Trek's the holiest of the holies of film and TV music to me. So, of course, I wanted to release it. And for the longest time, Paramount, they had administration that would not do any licensing. They didn't believe in it. If you say to them, I'll make you $10,000. I mean, that's not even lunch money. They're doing deals for composers for like $300,000, for $800,000. And they don't even want to deal with the paperwork. So there was administration at Paramount for the longest time that was not helpful. And then Paramount, they merged with CBS and then they divorced from CBS and now they've merged again, during which time all the television properties went over to CBS. So I was doing my CD label for many years when it turned out that the administration at Paramount had changed. And suddenly a super cool guy was in charge of the business affairs, a guy who had been just a friend of mine who had really been always so kind to me. And he made my first album deal happen. When I didn't know anything, he's like, okay, I know what you want. I can make this happen. I'll go to my boss. I'll get permission. Just a great, great, great super dude. And I was being given a tour of Paramount and I turned the corner and my old friend was sitting in the big desk. I was like, you're running this now? And I was like, oh, this will be fun. So then we did Star Trek 2. And the way the licensing works is a little complicated, not worth explaining, but because of the original vinyl album record deals they did at the time of the movies, the Star Trek soundtrack rights are not solely with Paramount, but they're all spread out. So each movie was its own record deal. And sometimes there was not a lot of logic involved with who got the license. Sometimes it was the flavor of the moment. Sometimes it was if they had an artist who we wanted to be on the soundtrack, we would go with them. So there was like every movie is its own thing. So you have to go to that original record company, their successor in interest, and do 2 deals for the same score because you have to get the record tracks and then the unreleased film tracks. So it's a pain in the butt, but you can do it. So we did do it. And I did Star Trek 2 and it was one of my all-time favorite scores and had unreleased cues that I always wanted to hear. And And so that was the first one. Then we did Star Trek 3. And then by then, I think that some of my competitors, who were also my friends, got the rights because they were there ahead of me to Star Treks 1 and 5 and 4 and 6. But I had already been working with Paramount. So I was like, look, I'm happy for you to do this on your label, but I've already sort of figured out how to work with their vaults. And could I collaborate with you and help with some of the production? Because I can pull the tapes and, my buddy and I can do the liner notes. So we all kind of teamed up to do it together. And then I was able to get an introduction from my friend at Paramount to CBS. And I was able to do the Ron Jones scores because those scores were very special to me. When I was 15, 16 years old, my parents were divorced and my whole world was the third season of Star Trek Next Generation. And I was trying my hand at being a screenwriter. And I was sending spec scripts to Michael Pillar's office or to Eric Stillwell. Star Trek was unlike any other TV show. When Michael Pillar came in the third season, the cupboards were bare. And he recognized that it was a very unique show. And they were having a very hard time having regular TV writers write for Star Trek because Roddenberry had said, I don't want conflict between our characters, which means no conflict, no drama. And these guys were like, how do I write this? This is insane. So they were having a really hard time getting people up to speed with Star Trek land. So Michael Pillar said, let's just open it up and read fan scripts. And, we'll get 100 of them. 98 will be terrible, but 2 of them might be really great. Or they might have really good ideas, then we can just buy the idea and turn that into an episode. So I don't remember how I even heard, but there were a lot of fans who ended up, like Tin Man is based on a fan script. And that episode, Tin Man in particular, they were like out of scripts. So that script is very similar to the fan script. So most of the time they would be rewritten by the staff. Ron Moore was discovered this way. And that might've been one of the reasons why Pillar started doing this. Because Ron Moore was just a fan with no TV experience. And he had like a girlfriend who worked for an office and he got a set tour and he slipped them the bonding. And then 9 months later, like they found the bonding when they needed scripts and Pillar was like, this is great. Let's buy this and make it. And so I was trying my hand as a 16-year-old and all my scripts were terrible. They were all just like stupid fan service. They were, they looked like scripts, but they didn't really have the dramatic structure. So, and the ideas weren't very good. So, but I worked so hard on them and it was my dream to write Star Trek. And I was watching Star Trek, just religiously. I would tape the episodes. I would pore over the episodes. And in the process of doing that, I became really infatuated with the music scores because I'd always been a fan of the original series and of the films. But when it started, the Next Generation, the music scores they were aesthetically different. They were more electronic. It took me a while to warm up to them, but I really got invested in what Ron Jones was doing. And he would score typically every other episode. And he would treat each one like a film. And he was very much influenced by Jerry Goldsmith. And he wrote very thematically. The other composer at the time, Dennis McCarthy, sort of had a different philosophy for his scores where they were all kind of one continuing saga. He didn't really write themes. So it was very hard for me to remember his scores because they didn't have tunes per episode the way Ron's did. And it's just a matter of taste. But it was to my taste, I really loved Ron's scores. And late in the 4th season, they basically let Ron go because they didn't like what he was doing. And Ron's a character. He's a character. And he's a passionate person. But he was not taking stenography from producers. He was very artistic. And after 4 years, they're like, okay, enough of this. And they got Jay Chattaway, who had filled in a couple of times to be the regular composer. So for the most of the history of the Rick Berman era shows, the composers were Dennis McCarthy and Jay Chattaway. And then as they were doing 2 shows at the same time, they brought in David Bell and Paul Bellorgian and then Velton Ray Bunch, a couple of people who just did an episode or 2. But I really love the Ron Jones scores, and so I was able to get a license from CBS to do a big box set. Is this the question you asked?
I'm not sure, but this is actually much more interesting than whatever the hell I asked, so I'm all for it. Yeah, because this is stuff I actually really want to get to know with you, is a lot of the Star Trek music history. I think it's really cool to hear, and again, it's something I'm pretty ignorant about, so it's really cool to hear about this kind of stuff. But I do actually want to take one step backwards for a second, and you mentioned how you're making these CDs, and you have access to the vault, and like in my mind, I'm just picturing this like maximum security physical vault where there's like guards posted all the time, keeping people out of there. But really, what exactly is it that you're going into a vault? Let's say, what is it that's in there? And
well, it's not like Harry Potter.
That ruins the whole image for me.
Or Indiana Jones. No, it's just these. There would typically be a building on the lot at Paramount. They call it the archive building, and they have shelving, and the shelving has tapes, but most of it is in deep storage. So there's some companies. There are a few in the Valley. There's one called Film Bond. I don't know. They change hands. They get different names, but they're just these big warehouses that are climate controlled that have shelving and have barcodes, and so it's not really all that mysterious. And so when you're requesting the tapes, you use the inventory system, and you can sort by title or sort by format. Half-inch tape or quarter-inch tape or 2-inch tape. They're different phases of the recording process, and you kind of learn the different recording eras and what outputs they were likely to have. And then they're just stored. Some of them are stored in these literal salt mine vaults in Kansas, where they're deep underground and they're climate controlled and they're sort of earthquake proof and they're super secure. And then you just say, you give them the barcode, and then they put it in a box and FedEx it, and then the studio contact and say, okay, that box came in and I've got the tapes you wanted. And so it was always sort of like is everything there? Because some tapes would get lost from earthquake damage when the 94 Northridge quake, there was sprinkler systems went off, and so some studios lost assets from water damage. There was a fire at Universal in 2008 that they won't talk about for insurance reasons, but they lost a lot of stuff. Mostly not Universal Studios, but Universal, the music company, which is different. It's kind of Byzantine, the different, there's Warner Brothers, the record company, Warner Brothers, the film company, and there's Universal Music and Universal Studios, and it's kind of confusing. And I've learned how the different corporate families sold and bought and sold all their catalogs.
So you're getting these tapes we're talking about right now, and so I'm wondering, since you mentioned that you had to remix a lot of these for different things, like, are you getting stems? Are you getting the entire piece, which would be, I guess, let's say one flat file to work on, or do you basically build layers upon layers when you're in post production room? I guess making these.
Well, mixes? I was never in post production, so I was working with the products of post production. So, okay. But to give you an example, if it was 1990 and they were doing Star Trek Next Generation, they had several tapes running at the same time in the recording room.
Okay, like one of those 16-track recording kind of things?
After 16-track, they would have 24 tracks. So it's a 2-inch tape, so it's like this thick. Did you ever see Brainstorm?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 2-inch tape, but that was like some toy thing they got for the movie. So, but that's the kind of thing it is. It's like 2-inch tape. It's like if you watch an old Beatles documentary, you see this stuff. If you watch Get Back. So it'd be a 2-inch tape, and it has 24 channels. Not all the channels would be used. And they would lay out the different tracks of the orchestra. So like the flute would be on one track, the clarinet would be on another track, the trumpets would be on a track, the French horns would be on the track, the high strings would be on the track, the low strings would be on the track, the percussion would be on, it's all different based on the recording engineer and the composer's preference. So those would be what we call the multi-tracks, that if you wanted to do a new mix from scratch, and sometimes the composer would ask to do that, you could pull these 2-inch tapes and you could put it all into the computer in Pro Tools. They used to do it live with mixing boards, but now they would do it in the computer because it's just easier and cheaper and kind of safer too. You transfer it, then you're not handling the original asset anymore. You've just got it all in the computer at a very high sampling rate. And, you have a lot of control to fix performance errors. You can pull pieces from a different take and drop it in. All kinds of trickery with digital mastering. If the recording is degraded, you can fix things. You can if it's overblown, you can fix it. If it has a pop, you can draw it out on the waveform. It's a very technical process. Some of my friends and colleagues are extremely good at it, and they're the real students of it. I'm not, although I came to know what it could and couldn't do. So, but back to the mixing stage, they would run that 2-inch track that's pretty much the backup.
Okay.
They would also do a live mix because they didn't really have time and money in television to mix it twice. So they would prefer to have a live mix that would be on what would they use? Sometimes on a 1/2-inch tape, but they were only using 2 channels of it. And they would also, I think, run it live to a 2-track DAT or maybe a D88. It's just different audio and digital formats. They had all these redundant things running. And throughout the history, like when we did the original series, they would record, I'm not exactly sure, they would record a live mix that was mono, because of course television until the 80s was always mono. And sometimes if they wanted more control over it, they would record it also onto a stereo, onto a 1/2-inch 3-track or 4-track tape, or onto 35 millimeter 3-track film or 4-track film. They would also use a sync tone. So there's one channel of the tape or the film that just has a hum. It just has a tone to it, because they can use that tone to align the tape and make sure that it's running at the correct speed, because otherwise it would get out of sync. When you're running 35 millimeters mag, because of the sprockets, it's always running at the right speed, I think, or maybe not. Maybe I'm so ignorant that I'm wrong. But anyway, they would have this tone on it so that they could adjust the machinery on their playback equipment and make sure that it was always running true at the correct speed. Because analog machines, you'll have what they call analog drift. And it may be imperceptible to the ear, but over a 3-minute piece of music, it'll be off by a second, which is enough to be out of sync with the film.
So I'm just curious, Lucas, from all the Star Trek CDs you sold, what was the most popular one?
I think on my label, Star Trek 2, and I think the Star Trek 15 CD box set from the original series.
Okay.
Because that was really like the holy grail, because those scores were libraries. It was a sort of a library concept. Are you familiar with this?
I know nothing about any of this.
Okay, great. Easy. Okay, back in the 60s, they had a certain rule with the musicians union that when they're making television shows, they were obligated to employ musicians to do maybe like 8 or 9 episodes. But once they had satisfied that quota, they were allowed to reuse the recordings. And that's why a lot of the original Star Trek music is so familiar, because after they did their 8 or 9 original scores, they would just use the old scores over and over. It would be a music library. So you'd hear, da-da, it was the same stings and it was the same fight music over and over again.
That's why we heard like the arena theme by Gerald Fried like 100 times.
Exactly. Because it was a library, and because they could not afford to pay a composer to do a new score, and it was just not in their budget. So for a lot of reasons, the original Star Trek movie, it really burned its way into our ears, because we were hearing the same pieces over and over, and those love themes and those fight themes and those suspense themes became so familiar. By the time they got into the 80s, the musicians union rules had changed, and they were obligated to use to have a new recording done every episode. So every episode of The Next Generation onward has a custom composed original score, but also the aesthetics had changed. And it was one of the things they discovered when they were doing The Next Generation. I don't know if you remember this, but the very early racist episode, Code of Honor, has a score by Fred Steiner, who was one of the original series composers. And that was the original plan, that Fred was still around and working, and that he would rotate with Dennis McCarthy and Ron Jones, but they did one episode, and his style was just, it was just old fashioned, and it didn't work it was just too, they didn't, Rick Berman especially really did not like music that was in your face. He didn't like music to be a cinematic component to the scoring. That's another reason why they let Ron Jones go, because Rick Berman believed that the music was it was sort of best as a kind of wallpaper, and that anything that was too thematic or too unique or too memorable to the ear would be distracting from the drama, or that it might be kind of mocking the drama or mocking the audience, or it would take him back to an era where the music was just too corny, for lack of a better word. And that was his judgment, and he was the boss. And as a music fan, I think that was misguided. And I think that his composers could have done a lot more. I know, because I knew them, and they would tell me on the record and off the record that they found it kind of confounding that they were not allowed to write as expressively or as thematically as they would want to do for these very interesting, very heartfelt, very emotional shows. They were being asked to take the emotion out of the music when that's the whole thing. That's the whole reason the music is there, to add the emotion. But Rick Berman is not a very emotional man.
Well, that much we do know, yeah. I heard, I think I read something about this on possibly in your blog, possibly somewhere else, but I heard that the Star Trek The Motion Picture score was the whole production was apparently a little bit tumultuous, but I heard the score also had some things going on with it. Can you tell us any stories about the first Star Trek movie?
Of course. So the first Star Trek movie has one of the all-time great, not just Star Trek scores, but any score from any movie. It's by Jerry Goldsmith, who's one of the all-time geniuses, and his credits, Planet of the Apes, Papillon, Chinatown, Poltergeist, Total Recall. It's like 90 or 150. I don't even know how many, but it's like 90 amazing genre scores. The Omen, he won an Oscar. And he was the greatest. And he almost threw me out of the scoring stage for LA Confidential. So he was hired by Robert Wise to score Star Trek The Motion Picture because it was a very big, prestigious movie. They had a very prestigious director. And Robert Wise had worked with Jerry Goldsmith on The Sand Pebbles. They knew each other. They liked each other. And it was just great casting for the first Star Trek score. In fact, they wanted to get Jerry Goldsmith as far back as the television show, but either they couldn't work out the fee or the budget or the schedule. But so they hired Jerry Goldsmith, and the production of Star Trek The Motion Picture was so tumultuous, and Gene Roddenberry was so interfering, and they were so behind the eight ball when they were shooting without a finished script, that it all dragged on. And then they had a massive, massive problem with the special effects, because their original effects vendor, Robert Abel, basically talked a good game, but he was not able to deliver. He couldn't get it done. And so after a year of listening to Robert Abel talk about how great he was and seeing all these amazing posters and paintings and concept art, Robert Wise had to fire him because he hadn't done any work, and they were locked into their release date because of the blind booking that they did with the movie theaters. So if they were not able to meet their December 7th release date, they would have to refund millions and millions of dollars in penalties to all the movie theaters. So the movie had to be done at this date, and they had John Dykstra's outfit, and they had Douglas Trumbull's outfit working around the clock on the special effects, which in the end were beautiful. But at the time, they were desperate because they didn't even know what they got done. It was just the absolute worst way to make a movie. So for the music, the composer cannot write music without the film. You can write themes, you can kind of work up musical ideas, but so much of the effort is into synchronizing the composition on a second by second basis with the movie. And if there's no movie, he can't write any music. Plus, if it's just he's writing to black screens that says V'ger here, it's like, well, what is this? So they had booked Jerry Goldsmith to be on a weekly salary, which is how they did it back then, starting, I think, in July or maybe August. And he didn't have anything to score. And they finally got him some live action scenes, and they got him like a temporary version of the Enterprise flyby. And he finally had enough footage that he could sort of see what he was scoring. And he did a first attempt and recorded maybe 20 to 25 minutes of music, but it did not have the Star Trek theme that you and I now know and love. It had an earlier version. It was sort of the same musical idea, but it was not the march. It was not in the same form. And this was very rare for Jerry to not get something right. And Bob Wise had to take him aside and say, I think we have a problem. It's not really working. It's too nautical. It's too much like sailing ships. It's not really capturing this movie the way I think it has to. And that, plus the fact that they didn't have any other picture to score, they just said, okay, let's just pull the plug for a month. And so Jerry went away, and then he figured out the Star Trek theme, and he wrote the rest of what we know as the theme to The Next Generation as it was repurposed, and everything was fine. But now the clock is ticking into October, and what happened with Jerry Goldsmith is he no longer had enough time. There just wasn't enough minutes of man hours that he could write this music. So they had to bring in Fred Steiner to ghostwrite, I think, 10 cues. So they would go over it together, and Fred would use Jerry's tunes, but Fred would just sort of write the cues in the style of Jerry Goldsmith. So in the end, the score was a collaboration. It's Jerry Goldsmith's score, but it does have some cues that were ghostwritten by Fred Steiner. The uses of the original series theme were done by Sandy Courage. And I think somebody else did, Ian Fraser is the guy's name, who did the love theme, the overture version of Ilea's theme. Hmm. So that just by nature of movie scheduling, they had to have some other hands in there to get it done. But in the end, it's genius. It's one of the all-time greats.
Yeah, I always remember the first time I saw Star Trek the Motion Picture and I heard the theme for it, and I was like, that's the Next Gen theme. I was just not expecting it. I didn't know it.
Well, you're a kid.
Yeah,
for us, it was the other way around. I was so excited for Encounter at Farpoint. So what's the new theme going to be? And then when it went into this, I was like, I already know this. I wanted a new theme.
Well, yeah, on that note, I mean, I'd love to hear, what is your personal favorite theme from Star Trek? And that's across all the different shows. And I guess to put on top of that, too, for the folks who have done like the classic version of the theme, who did it the best?
Oh, I prefer the original. Probably the original second season version that Sandy did that has the singer, the vocal. Because in the first season, there's two versions. One of them has an electric violin. And then there's a version that Fred Steiner arranged that has the melody on a cello. I prefer the original. My overall favorite Star Trek music, at the very crowded field, but I still prefer the James Horner score to Star Trek 2 and 3. It's my favorite film too, Star Trek 2.
Well, for someone who knows music like you do, what is it that for you makes it so special, makes it so great?
Well, James Horner was a really incredibly gifted man, and he did that when he I don't think he was even 30 years old. And he was an eccentric person. His family, I don't know if you know this, but he died in a plane crash. He died in some years ago. I forget the exact year. And he was a hobbyist. He liked to fly planes, and he was in one of his hobbyist single person airplanes, and it crashed. He died. So that's a very dangerous hobby. But his family since then has been very outspoken about saying that he was pretty much on the autism spectrum. And that for him, scoring movies was his emotional communication. And that he was somebody who found it very difficult in real life to communicate emotion, to communicate love for his family. And, he was a difficult person to get along with. He could be very interior and non-communicative. And his way of channeling that feeling was through his music. And so a lot of fans find James Horner's scores to be the most gorgeous and emotional. I mean, he did Cocoon and Willow and Titanic, of course, and Braveheart and A Beautiful Mind and Apollo 13 and many, many famous movies. And he really had a gift for connecting emotionally to audiences. But he was also something of a prodigy as a composer. And at a very young age was able to master orchestration and to have the orchestra just be very delightful to listen to have all these sort of rolling nautical, it feels like ocean waves. It feels very seafaring. which was the mandate that he got from Nick Meyer, because Nick Meyer was trying to do Hornblower. Nick Meyer didn't really understand or even like Star Trek. But he was, the job was there, and he was interested because he realized they reminded him of Horatio Hornblower, which he did love those books. And Roddenberry had also used that as a template. So that was very much the guiding light of Star Trek II. And that was communicated to James Horner, who picked it up for this beautiful seafaring nautical type music. And then he wrote the, these battle scenes. The whole concept in that movie is that it's like World War II, the frigate against the submarine. And the way he had these chattering brass and these wonderful fanfares. And it just has this wonderful swelling electric feeling of the majesty of the orchestra, and how he was able to draw upon 20th century classical literature, and he ripped some stuff off that is known to us nerds. And I think that's a story that Nick Meyer tells, because he heard a passage that's pretty much from Alexander Nevsky by Prokofiev. And Nick on the scoring stage pulled him aside and said, what is this? You think I don't know what this is? And Horner said, I'm young. I just haven't outgrown my influences. But that's my favorite. And it's really my favorite film. It's the most mature. It's the most adult. I think it's the best that Shatner has ever been. And it's just not, it was before Star Trek kind of had to acknowledge its own weight as a pop icon. So it didn't have this silly it wasn't winking, it was just like this dramatic story about this old sea captain and his friend, and then this bad guy tries to kill him. And it's just this sci-fi movie that happens to be Star Trek.
Yeah, I think the fact that Nick Meyer just wasn't really a Trekkie also is part of why it's so good. Like, he didn't really feel like he had to do a lot of the things that Star Trek fans expected. He could just do whatever he wanted.
A lot of the most consequential creators have not been Star Trek fans. Michael Piller was not really into it. Rick Berman, I don't think, was a big Star Trek person. I may be wrong. I can't quite remember what I'm referencing, but J.J. Abrams never really liked it. And I know there's some debates in fan circles about how he kind of turned it into Star Wars, but he definitely made it very popular. And all the new shows are following the style that he laid out.
And Lucas, as we're coming to close of this interview here, I do want to mention again, I just feel so bad that I feel like I can't actually talk about music that well. It's just not something I really specialize in. I don't really have a great vocabulary or knowledge base about it. So it's been real helpful having this conversation with you today.
No, it's really fine. Music is unlike almost all of the other aspects of Star Trek that have been studied and admired away from the episodes and the movies. You can look at the costumes. You can look at the blueprints. You can look at the props. You can look at the set design. You can look at the world building. You can look at the alien races. You can look at the languages. But it's all very much from the world building. And the music is the one thing that is abstract. And it's the emotional content of the storytelling in it. And so it's really the polar opposite of all these other things. And because of that, if you don't have experience in that, it can be hard to articulate. But I tend to think, having spent most of my life talking about this stuff and evangelizing for music that's very meaningful to me, that there's really nothing at all wrong with people loving things or having opinions and having tastes, even if they're not, at all educated musically or cinemusically. It's really, it's all here for us to enjoy it, and everybody's opinion is valid. So I don't care at all.
All right, so Lucas, you mentioned a few other things you're working on at the start of this interview, but just kind of fill my audience in on what else is going on for you these days. What else are you working on?
Well, I'm a struggling filmmaker, and people can go to lukaskendall.com, but that is spelled funny. Thanks, parents. LUKASKENDALL.com. Like a lot of people, I've got scripts, I've got TV scripts, and I'm in the process of just kind of peddling them. And, you're trying to get agents to pay attention, trying to get financiers to pay attention. And it's brutal. It's really brutal, but it's a passion, it's a calling. And so that's what I'm doing. But I blog every day, and sometimes I talk about Star Trek, and I've told a lot of funny stories. I think they're funny from my past.
All right, so anybody wants to check them out, we're going to have links in the show notes, so make sure you visit lukaskendall.com for all that fun stuff. Lucas, last thing for today, what is the best thing about being a part of the Star Trek universe?
I've never felt like I was a part of the Star Trek universe. I always felt like I was sort of a custodian or a curator for a certain small aspect of it. And it was simply my job to see to it that the public got to experience and access all this wonderful music that was so meaningful to me. But I think that because I'm on your show, if we're acknowledging that I am a part of the Star Trek legacy, even in a small way, it's a great privilege, because there's just so much dystopian and dispiriting stuff, a lot of which I love. But it's so important that there be Star Trek to be optimistic and to speak to our better selves.
Yeah, and whether you like it or not, you are indeed part of the Star Trek universe, because you are the person that kept that music alive, and a lot of that music that wouldn't have been heard, really, without you doing it. So,
thanks.
Thank you for really keeping it out there, keeping that spirit of the music alive. And again, I apologize today for not knowing all these music things. I wish I knew more, but you've been a wonderful educator, and I'm sure my audience appreciates this lesson too. So thank you so much, Lukas.
All right, thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Until next time, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Trek Untold, all one word. If you'd like to directly support this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter over on patreon.com/TrekUntold, which gives you access to some great perks that can't be beat. Or pick up some merchandise from our store, or use my Amazon shop link to check out all kinds of different Star Trek merchandise. Links for all these things are in the show notes. Shout out to Triple Fiction Productions for being a key sponsor of Trek Untold. Don't forget to check them out and all of the fine folks whose ads you've seen or heard on this podcast too. If you have any questions, feedback, or comments for the show, or would like to suggest a guest or discuss sponsorship options for any of these episodes in the future, send me a message at trekuntold@gmail.com. I hope to see you here again as we uncover more untold stories from Star Trek and beyond, and get to know even more amazing people who have contributed to this ever-expanding universe. Until next time, I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, and remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the RageWorks podcasting network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.